Today it is our distinct honor to be speaking with Dr. Ryrie Beitzel. Dr. Beitzel is Professor Emeritus of Old Testament and Semitic Languages at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in Deerfield, Illinois, and is the author of many books on geography, including a classic book that I love. This is not the book that we're going to be discussing today, but I think is a fitting for the intro, the new Moody Atlas of the Bible, a tremendous tool with significant heft that really opens the pages of Scripture in a beautiful way. And one of the projects that Dr. Beitzel has been working on in the last several years is a 6-volume commentary series, a geographic commentary series by Lexham Press, the Lexham Geographic Commentary. And this is the volume that we'll be discussing today. This is the second volume to be released. It's also the second volume of the New Testament. So actually it's the very last, according to the canonical order of the series, but it's the second of 6 volumes to appear in print. Lexham Geographic Commentary on Acts through Revelation. Dr. Beitzel, we're super grateful to be speaking with you today.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and I'm pleased to be here.
So, Dr. Beitzel, the Lexham Geographic Commentary series is going to have 6 volumes, and just so we all get this squarely in our minds, the Lexham Geographic Commentary on the Gospels was the first to release, and we did an interview on that. I loved that piece, came out about a year ago, and that was one of the reasons why I was so excited to be able to speak to you again. This text we'll be speaking about today, and there's 4 more volumes that will come out in this series: the Lexham Geographic Commentary on the Pentateuch, and then 2 on the historical volumes, and then also the Lexham Geographic Commentary on Poetry and Prophecy. So what inspired you to create this commentary series, please?
Well, I suppose it's a combination of a general observation that we as evangelicals, and actually other believers beyond people who would avow evangelicalism, believe that God is a God of space and time, and that in the scriptures, God speaks to definite people about definite messages at definite places and at definite times. So that was a kind of a beginning. If we believe that we have a space God, a space-time God, then the corresponding entities there, the corresponding entity to time would be history, and the corresponding entity to space would be geography. So my interest originally was that I believe that God is a God of space and time. Coupled with that was the subsequent realization that the Bible's use of space, the Bible's use of geography, is actually quite distinctive from what is found in any of the other major religions of the world. For example, in Hinduism, there's really next to nothing in which the holy writings of Hinduism reflect geography or space. There's a passing reference. In fact, there are several dozen passing references to the so-called 7 rivers. The identity of those rivers varies. If you read in the scholarship in that field, you see that they vary from scholar to scholar and from time to time. But beyond the passing reference to those rivers, there's really nothing that is correlated to space. Buddhism is, they're probably in all of the writings of Buddhism, not more than about 3 dozen references to this or that place. But none of those references, I believe it is fair to say, play a role in the theology or in the teaching. In other words, they're more or less pragmatic. They tell us where Buddha spent a night, or where he gave a certain sutta, a certain teaching, or where he was during the rainy season. Taoism, the third of the 5 largest religions of the world, is actually the least geographically conscious, sensitive document. It does make mention, occasional reference to passing unnamed valley or river or mountain or something like that, but really not much more. The last of the 5, other than Christianity, would be in Islam. And it's true that the Quran parallels the Bible a little bit closer than those other sacred writings, but in terms of space, many of the places that are mentioned in the Quran seem to be borrowed from the Bible. So the Quran makes mention of the Garden of Eden, of Mount Sinai, of Babylon, of Gog and Magog, and so forth and so on. But actually, not that many, fewer than we have in our Bibles in Genesis 1 to 12. The Quran also tends to have a bit of an antipathy towards towns and cities. In the Quran, according to the Quran, I guess I should say, it's in cities where people are sinners, where they commit flagrant acts of sin, or it is from cities and towns that righteous people have been evicted, which I suspect is doubtless a reflection of Muhammad's own experience. In vivid contradistinction to these other major religions, the Bible is replete with references that are spatial/geographic in nature. By my rough count, there are at least 900 different towns or cities mentioned in our scriptures. Almost all of them are referenced repeatedly, and more than 200 of them will use a name that can refer to more than one place by that name. So there's more than one Bethlehem in Scripture. There's more than one, and so forth. Sometimes 3, 4, 5, 6. And that does not include dozens of references to certain named mountains or rivers or valleys or regions or provinces and so forth and so on. But it's not just the mere volume of references, though I would parenthetically underscore that does itself set the Bible's tone in contrast to other sacred writings. It is not just that volume, it's also often the use of scripture that writers, it's the use of geography that writers of scripture make. Often a certain incident is said to have occurred at a given named valley, at a certain mountain, mentioned by name. And oftentimes there can be a play on words. The place is called Babel because it was a place of confusion. The Hebrew letters that are in the word Babel, BBL, sound like the verb for confusion, BLL. And so the name of the place is often used to reinforce the reality. And that would be very relevant when one is dealing with oral traditions and so forth and so on. And then there are certain whole segments of scripture. For example, in the book of Deuteronomy, the notion of fertility and being able to be in the land is very much woven into the fabric of a whole section of that book. Think how often in the book of Psalms there are references to what I would call hydrology, to storms and water and rain and snow and the like. And they're not just in passing, they are woven into the fabric of the theology. Or look how the notion of agriculture plays a prominent role in a book like Joel, Then there are geographical citations or references that allow scholars to identify where a book comes from. The book of Amos comes from the northern kingdom, or the book of James comes from the Eastern Mediterranean because of certain geographic allusions that are found in the book. And perhaps most prominently is the reality, particularly in the Gospels, where Jesus uses his physical spatial surroundings to make his message. When Jesus completes the feeding of the 5,000, we're told that he goes to Capernaum. And goes into the synagogue of Capernaum and preaches what we call today the bread of life text, where he talks about needing, he's the bread of life. And then in the Old Testament, people were given bread, that is manna, but they still got hungry and they still died. But I'm the bread of life and so forth. It seems ironic that Jesus did not preach that sermon while he had 5,000 people on the hills whom he had just fed, and try to use that feeding as an example of what he wanted to do. No, he rather goes to a more limited audience and to a particular location where Capernaum, where bread mills were manufactured. It's in Capernaum that Jesus twice talks about if you offend one of the little ones, and he had a child, and on one of those occasions he had a child sitting on his lap apparently, and he says to the people around him, it would be better if you offend one of these little ones. It would be better for you to have a millstone placed around your neck and to be cast into the deepest sea. He talks about millstones, and he talks about being bread in Capernaum, where bread played a part. It was a manufacturing center and so you go to Capernaum even today, and you find still today, dozens of grain mills and olive presses. And the reason is because it was very close to some volcanic sections where what is called basalt, which is a hardened volcano, it turns into rock, and it's a very harsh, very hard sort of rock, and so it's much better a source of material if you're trying to grind a mill and grain and so forth. On the other hand, when Jesus goes to a place like Caesarea Philippi, not at other places, but at Caesarea Philippi, that's where he says to his disciples, "Who do people say that I am? And then who do you say that I am?" And that's where Peter makes his great confession: "You are the Messiah, the Christos, the Son of the living God." And he says, remember the response, and there's that play on words. You are Petros, you are Peter, and upon this Petra rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades cannot prevail against it. That, for us in the world today, sounds like a very odd sort of thing, the gates of Hades. But when that statement is made at Caesarea Philippi, and one understands what's going on at Caesarea Philippi is a huge rock mountain. At the very bottom of that mountain is the site of Caesarea Philippi, and part of that mountain is a huge cavernous cave. And it's common in Greek mythology that a cave was the entrance to the next world. And across the Mediterranean, across Greece and into Europe, actually these days even one place in Africa, but including Caesarea Philippi, there was the presence of a cave that in Greek mythology was a place where people would go from this life to the next life. And the temple that was built at Caesarea Philippi did not even have a rear wall. It was built right into the edge of the cave so that people would pass through, the corpses would be carried through and right into the next world. So and those places are called in Greek literature, including in Homer, the gates of Hades, the entranceway to Hades. And so he uses his, I could go on here a little bit too, because that was a place where, it's a place where the god Pan was very present. It was a place that was sacred. Even the word Hermon, Mount Hermon, which is the rock face there, that is the mountain, means, well, there is a connection between the Hebrew word Herman, the first part of the Hebrew word Herman, and the Arabic word Haram. And it means sacred, it means holy. And in that case, the word Herman would be something that is reserved for God, or something that is belongs to God, is sacred to God. And twice in the Old Testament, it is referred to as Baal Herman. Baal is also a deity, a Canaanite deity, the chief god in the Canaanite pantheon, and so forth. So you're asking me if I could summarize your question. I think it's twofold. One, to observe that there is a space-timeness to the Bible that is very distinctive. Some people might even say unique to the Bible as over against sacred scriptures of major religions. And two, coupled with that is an on-site observation that biblical speakers and sometimes biblical writers make use of their spatial surroundings in order to underscore and make their point. That's not always the case. That's not even mostly the case. But in fairness, it is repeatedly and frequently the case. And so there's a whole dimension of Bible study that adds to one's ability to discern and understand more fully what is found in our Holy Scriptures.
This is absolutely amazing. And well, I'm going to read a piece here from the series preface, but I want to dig here a little deeper in just a moment. So this is a really unique resource that you've put together here. You've contributed to many Bible atlases, and that is a type of literature that's been fairly standard for many decades, maybe centuries. I don't know. You would, but atlases have been around for a long time. This geographic commentary seems to me like a kind of new idea, and it's intriguing. All of the and fascinating the way that you can make these sort of you can open up the meaning of a biblical text through a geographical observation. You systematically explain what you're doing in the series preface when you write this. The conceptual premise of this commentary holds that geography is a legitimate, if commonly overlooked, hermeneutical category. Even cursory reflection leads one to the inescapable conclusion that words from God have been revealed in real time about real people in real places. And we think it highly significant that authors who spell out for us the biblical storyline in terms of who, when, why, how, what, or so what, frequently add the element of where, whether implicitly or explicitly. If I can ask the question this way, where were you when you had the idea to create this unique study tool?
That's a question that is a bit easier to ask than it is to answer. I think it was a process more than a point. It was a growing conviction out of my own background. I mean, even before I became a Christian believer, I had an interest in spatial things. My father was a World War II veteran, and at the end of the war, he got into, I believe it was a Reader's Digest series of books, and they would books of the Second World War, and there were a lot of pictures. I originally, as a kid, I was looking at the pictures in my, but it wasn't too long until I saw that there was the use of maps in there, and I began to realize that the people who were doing those Reader Digest World War II books were using maps to tell a story. They could tell the story verbally, they could tell the story visually, and I tend to be a visual learner. That just, and I think many men in particular are visual learners. So that, I suppose, was the beginning of the process. Now, on the other end of, and of course, through my professional life, I've spent, I don't know how many dozens of trips to places in the Middle East, both Israel and other countries in the Middle East. and have had ample opportunity to be there for research purposes and to study this or that narrative. And the idea, the notion of being able to sit down on site and read a narrative or narratives or a text or texts that either relate to and or were written in or about that place is a whole dimension that can open to you. And again, though, it's a process rather than a particular point. And then I suppose near the end of that process, as I was coming near my retirement, and Lexham, Lagos and Lexham came to me, and I should say, I had done an atlas, an electronic atlas for Lagos about 15 years ago, I believe it was, probably 40, 50 maps in that series. And as it happened, just about the time that I was retiring from Trinity, Lagos came to me and asked if I would be willing to create for them I guess you would say, a major, and by that I mean about a 300 map electronic atlas of absolutely every event in the Bible. They wanted that graphed. And as we were working through that, in fact, on one occasion, I happened to be out in Bellingham working with people out there, and the subject came up of being able to expand this from just a mere atlas into a verbal and visual tool. And when that idea first arose, it had to do especially with the Gospels. And we did start with the Gospels, and we did then do the New Testament. But we now have 4 volumes in the hopper that include all of the Old Testament narrative and text as well. There are 2 volumes that are out. This series is being published electronically by Logos, and at the same time by Lexham Press, that's their corresponding press, in hard copy. The Pentateuch volume, which is about 350,000 words, I think that's about the same size as the volume that you're holding right there, or you have access to. Okay, that's about, and that is supposed to be coming out. Well, it's overdue. It was supposed to be coming out at the beginning of this year electronically, and then it was to come out in hard copy around just before Thanksgiving time. I'm told by the people out there that there's been a slight delay, and so but as far as the actual writing and as far as my editing, this entire project is basically done. Both the Pentateuch volume is completely edited, both of the historical books, and that's another 700,000 words, completely edited and submitted, and it's being processed right now in Bellingham. And the final volume, volume 6, is basically in, with the exception, and that's a shorter volume. It's about 250,000 words, and I would say I still have, well, about 10,000 words left. Now, much of the visual part of that, I mean, this series is not only 1.5 million words, it's also about 1,000 images. Eventually, there'll be about 1,000 images. That includes graphs and charts and photos of sites and maps. And if you add up all of that, there'll be about 200 to 250 such images in each of the volumes. So when is it going to be done? When is it going to be completely out? All I can say is that my work is basically done. So I'm not in a position to answer that beyond knowing where my part of the work lies. And I expect to have those last 10,000 words done before the end of July.
Congratulations. 1.5 million words. What an extraordinary project. Dr. Beitzel, if I can dive into chapter 6 of this text, and that's titled The Location of Pentecost and Geographical Implications in Acts 2. That's the name of the chapter, written by Chris McKinney. And he argues that the events of Pentecost, so the coming of the Holy Spirit, Peter's sermon is recorded in Acts 2, and the conversion of 3,000 people. He argues that that took place not in the traditional side of the upper room, which is on the western side of the old city of Jerusalem, around what's traditionally called David's tomb, but rather that that took place in the temple precincts. And for those of us who might have had an opportunity to go to Jerusalem, we loved seeing the upper room and being there. So we got to get that image potentially out of our minds as the location for those events and think rather up on top of the western wall there, up on the Temple Mount. That'd be quite a change. What's your view of this new idea?
Well, I don't know that it's a particularly new idea, but I will give you a response. You're asking for personal opinion. I think anyone who tries to answer that question is bound to recognize that the actual evidence that we have is murky and somewhat limited. There's another aspect of this that I think plays into one's answer to that question. And it is this. We're told in Acts 1 that the disciples, having seen Jesus ascending, returned to Jerusalem, and they went to the upper room. That's before the end of chapter 1. And then it identifies the fact that there are 11 of them, and so forth and so on. All right, now I need to stop just for a brief parenthesis. The idea of the upper room being connected to the tomb of David, that part of it, even though that is the major tradition that is found in the early church, starting in about the 4th or 5th century, the upper room part of that may very well have a great deal of validity. David's tomb was inside the city at the time that David died. And so that would put his tomb immediately to the south of the temple area, not even on the Western Hill. So that part of it is, I think, an invalid, it's invalid, it's not demonstrable archaeologically. We've never yet found the tomb of David. We know that even from the scripture that he was buried inside the city walls. And the city walls of Zion, of Old Testament Zion, of the city of David and so forth, were restricted just to the east side of the interior valley, not out there. But the upper room part of this could very well be at the place where you say you've gone and you've had the upper room experience. All right, so step one in trying to address this question is that when the disciples came back from the Mount of Olives, we're told that they went to the upper room where they had been staying, and then they're identified by name, and there's a grand total of 11 of them. That's kind of step one. Then, towards the very end of chapter 1, we're told that there was a larger group of people, I think the figure is about 120, who had embraced the faith. At that point, I think one needs to go a little bit beyond the upper room, just in terms of being able to have as many as 120 people in one place. That's kind of step number 2. Then the third and final step, however, has to do with the actual Pentecost experience. And the first thing that one has to say is that, as you know, the word Pentecost means 50. And the Feast of Pentecost, this happened during the Feast of Pentecost. It's one of the regular feasts in the Old Testament calendar. And it occurred 50 days after the Passover. So there is a passage of time between the time that the 11 disciples are in the upper room, or even when they are together with 120, because on this occasion, we're told it was a huge crowd. And in fact, these are Jewish people from, and all of the nations are mentioned there. Well, I mean, I shouldn't say all nations, but many of the nations that were represented. And it must have been a massive crowd, because we're told specifically that of that crowd, some people believed, other people ridiculed. So it was by no means a unanimous decision, but even for those who believed, 3,000 people were added to the church. That requires a massive, spacious, open area. So logically, that eliminates, in my mind, not only the traditional upper room. The upper room was part of the 11, but I don't think part of the actual Pentecost. And inside the city of Jerusalem, the largest and most expansive location, where as many as several thousand people were able to hear and respond, would be somewhere in the temple precincts, and particularly for me, on just to the south of the temple. It's a huge platform. It was a huge, huge platform, and much of Jesus' teaching went on in that platform. The other thing that could be relevant to this is that as soon as you go to the very last verse of chapter 2, and then the first verse of chapter 3 of Acts, we see that Peter and the disciples are in the temple teaching and preaching. So I think Chris has a very defensible view. I do not think there would have been room, as much as we know from what Josephus has told us about the actual structure of buildings and so forth, in the upper city. That's where the upper room would have been. If it didn't happen in the temple precincts or in the immediate vicinity of the temple, then one would almost have to argue that it happened outside the city walls, in some basin or some plain. And I don't believe there's any, I'm not familiar with anyone who takes that view for some pretty obvious reasons.
Thank you very much, Dr. Beitzel, for that exposition. Moving through to chapter 25, we're going to move to about the middle of the book of Acts for this discussion. And your contributing author for this chapter is Mark Fairchild. He's discussing the first missionary journey of Paul, which takes place on Cyprus. And in Acts 13:13, we read that John Mark was one of the three who was leading this so-called first missionary journey of Paul, Barnabas, and John Mark. John Mark leaves the group. And this is apparently such a painful parting for Paul that at the end of chapter 15, when Barnabas is keen to take John Mark out again on another missionary journey, Paul flatly refuses. And Luke records for us there, the author of the book of Acts records for us that the difference of opinion there between Paul and Barnabas is so sharp that they can't work together. So we have two missions that go out at the end of the chapter.
Yes, that's right.
Many will note that Paul the Apostle does make up with John Mark toward the end of his life, at least by then. We read in 2 Timothy 4:11 that Paul praises John Mark as very useful for my ministry. But there's a puzzle there that we can't quite figure out. Why is Paul so offended at John Mark's departure? What is your answer to that Bible mystery?
I don't claim to have a unique insight on this, but as I have studied it, I would come to this conclusion. I think it's very important that we understand how dramatically and rapidly things were changing in the early Christian church. That sets the stage, in my mind, that sets the stage for Mark's departure. And what do I mean by that? Remember that immediately before this, Paul spoke with a Roman procurator whose name was Sergius Paulus. And that man, that procurator, came to Christian faith. That's what Luke records. And so for the first time in history, there was a Christian realm in the Roman Empire. That's completely different than what went on at Pentecost. Those were Jewish people who were embracing the gospel. That's one important factor. Another important factor is that up until this point in Luke's narrative, The apostle is identified by his Hebrew name, Saul, but now Paul. And whether or not that is, I think there is probability that Sergius Paulus, it's the same word in Greek, and it's in the text there, they're very same word. So Paul and Sergius Paulus make some connection, and all of a sudden, whereas the apostle was only known by the name Saul previous to this incident, from now on, with one exception, that is rehearsing what went on when he met the Lord on the road to Damascus, he's referred to as Paul. That's the second thing. And there's a third thing that plays into this in terms of how rapidly and how dramatically things are changing. We remember that the text tells us that when the church in Antioch was going to send out Paul and Barnabas, and in other narratives up until this event, the sequence is Barnabas and Saul consistently. As a result of this Sergius Paulus event, now, as soon as John Mark leaves, the very next verse says, now Paul and his company. Doesn't even mention Barnabas. We have to appreciate that there's a radical change here. This is like Pentecost in reverse. If you think about it for a moment, we now have an actual Gentile and one who's pretty heavily into the Roman world who has embraced Christianity. And so the answer to the question is, we don't know. Why did John Mark leave? My own view is that it was not a trivial decision. John Mark is portrayed both before and after this narrative as being a very stalwart member of faith. So I don't think you can, some people have wanted to argue that there was a little bit of family jealousy there. After all, remember, John Mark and Barnabas were cousins. And so they were in the same family. And when they left Antioch, you could say the general had the name Barnabas. And by the time they left Cyprus, the general had the name Paul. And so there's a little bit of family jealousy. I seriously find that hard to believe. I also don't think that he left because he was afraid that there were dangers that were going to await those people as soon as they got off the boat on Asia Minor, or that he didn't have the physical stamina to climb over the Taurus Mountains. Cyprus is easy picking, geographically speaking, compared to the kind of terrain that Paul and his company had to pass over. In other words, I don't think John Mark left because of trivial or fearful, or maybe even because of jealous family things. I think there was still uncertainty. I think we're so early in the church and things are moving so rapidly and so remember, we're before the Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15. There was going to be an entire convocation to discuss this question. So I guess what I'm saying is, I think it's fair to say that there was still considerable uncertainty about the legitimacy of the Gentile mission. That suggests, I believe what I just said is true. I think that's true. Whether or not that's the reason why John Mark left, I think that's true. Now, however, I do think if you want to give John Mark the benefit of the doubt, if he left for other reasons that were less lofty, one might have wondered whether Paul could have trusted him fully the way he did, even though it was 15, 18 years later. So I think we today, we believers, when we're reading those narratives right there around the time of the first missionary journey, even the whole concept of a missionary journey to a Gentile world, even though they were oftentimes normally going into the synagogue to begin, suggests strongly that it was going to be a Gentile mission. And I would argue it's very uncertain. Is it legitimate? Is it not legitimate? And I believe that's not all, but that's part of why Acts 15 records for us what we call the Jerusalem Council, where Peter, no less than Peter, stands up and declares his own experience that had occurred to him in Acts chapter 10 when he made that trip up to Caesarea and met Cornelius and saw that genuine faith in another Roman citizen and his family. So there was no circumcision. I mean, I think that's the big deal from Acts 15 from the Jerusalem Council. Yes, there are going to be certain provisions here, but people are no longer going to be required to be circumcised, etc., in order to be bona fide members of the community of faith. So I think we have the benefit. We sit today and we look back at that almost in a historical sense. We say, what was the big deal? I think if we would have been eyewitnesses, we would have been on the scene when Paul is having that discourse with Sergius Paulus and the implications and the consequences of that. All of a sudden, things are exploding theologically in the life of an infant early church.
It is amazing to me how much we begin to understand the biblical authors as people when we get an opportunity to follow in their footsteps. When I was at Oxford University, my mentor there was Peter Walker, who dedicated a substantial amount of his career to tracing out the footsteps of Paul. And that might be the book for which he's best known, In the Footsteps of Paul or In the Footsteps of Jesus.
Yes.
And I got a chance to go with him once as a young person, a relatively young person, to Turkey and Greece. And I felt a little of that transformation taking place. Now that I'm seeing what they were up against and what they were doing, I can start to read between the lines just a little bit to understand some of the motivations taking place. Amazing.
I think that we can have the same experience when we read, let's say, John's letters to the seven churches. And we can sit in the quietness and calmness of a library in a couch, well lighted, we're comfortable, we've got air conditioning, and we sit there and just read that as though we're reading, the Three Bears. There's almost no passion, there's no empathy, and so forth, and yet John is described the reality of those early churches that John is describing. In some respects, was life and death. The sort of tension that those people in that early church were facing. My response to most of those people is to want to pat them on the back and applaud them because of their raw courage.
Dr. Beitzel, if I can transition us at this time to chapter 40. Chapter 40 takes us into your article. The title is The Meaning of Arabia in Classical Literature in the New Testament. Arabia shows up in the New Testament, you inform us, only twice, both times in the book of Galatians, when Paul tells his reader that he, after his conversion experience, went out into Arabia. But you note that this term Arabia, although scarce in the New Testament, occurs in classical literature lots, over 2,000 times. And has a very widely differing senses. You chart out 9 specific and different meanings of this term Arabia in your article. So what does Paul mean when he uses the term Arabia in Galatians, please?
Well, I think the first point that I would say, Jonathan, is that Paul's use of Arabia, and in fact his use of prominent regional and territorial terms, and Arabia was a term that it was with the name of a province in the Roman Empire, and Paul uses a dozen and a half provincial names and so forth. And also most of the other biblical writers in the New Testament also use the same sort of either territorial or provincial names that were contemporary with them. The reason this is important in terms of my reply to you is that what the word Arabia does occur maybe 15 to 18 times in the Old Testament, either Arabia or Arab or Arabians. But one notes there, and I have a long footnote that gives all of that, all of those citations and all of that evidence, that you can see that it was not one place, even in the Old Testament. It varied in its location depending upon context. All right, I would say this. We know from the book of Acts, and actually Paul reminds us both in Corinthians and here in Galatians, he's walking on the Damascus Road when he's encountered by Jesus of Nazareth, which is, by the way, parenthetically, one of the few times where Jesus himself says that he's Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus of Nazareth he's often identified even on the cross, on the inscription, but that comes out of other people's mouths. In this case, it's not unique, but it's very unusual. But the point is, Paul was on the road to Damascus when he had his conversion experience. He then goes to Arabia, and as soon as he's done with his mission in Arabia, to preach the gospel to the Gentiles, verse 16 of Galatians chapter 1, he goes back to Damascus. So he was on the road to Damascus. So I think that probably means he was not too far. I mean, how near to Damascus he may have been, we don't know. But the point is, he was not on the road to Jerusalem. He was not on the road to Gaza. He was on the road to Damascus. So I would assume that means he was maybe not too far away from that. And as soon as he got done with his mission, he tells us there in Galatians 1 that he went back to Damascus. And in fact, he had an incident then that is recorded both in the book of Acts and in the book of 1 Corinthians, where there was all kinds of fury that was created in the city, and they had to put him in a basket and hoist him over the wall because there were people that were after him. Now, in Paul's own discussion of that incident, where he had to be put over the basket, that is in Corinthians, he ascribes ultimate responsibility to King Emeritus. King Emeritus is known, he's one of the guys named Emeritus, who was a king who was fairly well mid-frequency in classical literature. He was the king of Petra. Well, he was the king of Arabia Petraea. That is Arabia of Petra, Arabia. And he was the king probably for about 40 years, from about the time Jesus was born until I think it was almost 45 or something like that. So it was during that time when this incident occurred. That, I think, plays a role in this whole incident. Where did he go? My way of approaching that is we don't know, but there are probably three Arabias that would remain in the picture. One of them was Arabia Petraea, and Arabia of Petra, or Petra of Arabia, or Arabia of the Nabateans, that's all the same terms that were used before the time of Paul, would have run basically from Damascus in the north down almost to the Red Sea and would have taken in most of the Sinai Peninsula. That's Arabia Petraea. Then there was an Arabia of the East, clear out in what we would call the Eastern Desert, today known as the Syrian Desert. And then there was a Arabia that would have been in modern Saudi Arabia. So I think when you're talking about where did he go to Arabia, there are three options. But they don't all have equal footing, at least not in my judgment. To judge from what we know about Paul's missionary journeys, and he tells us that he went there to preach the gospel to the Gentiles. What we know about his three missionary journeys is that he was very much involved in municipal ministry. He was not out in the roads. He was not out in the sticks. He was not out in the deserts. He was in towns and synagogues. He was rubbing up against the elbows and the shoulders of people. His ministry was a direct, and you might even say a confrontational ministry. That reality, when applied to his ministry here, when he tells us he's going to preach to the Gentiles, suggests strongly to me that it was not out in the middle of the largely unpopulated Syrian desert or the largely unpopulated Arabian desert. It was to those towns and cities right along that road that would have joined Damascus, and so in effect, then the mayor of Damascus, an appointee of King Emeritus, tries to take a stand, try to make a step that would have kept Paul inside the city and inside a prison and so forth. That makes sense if the commotion that had been created by Paul's 3 years of ministry, that's how long it was also in Arabia Petraea.
Dr. Beitzel, if I can ask two remaining questions, one geographical and one theological. I'd like to touch on one final article in the volume. This is from article chapter 47. It's titled Geography of the Island of Patmos. And as our viewers may know, the island of Patmos is off the northwest coast of Turkey. This is, of course, where John is exiled when he receives the revelation that's recorded in the final book of our New Testament, the Revelation of John. And I've never had an opportunity to be there, to be on the island of Patmos. It's a little more rare for people to get out there. But what is it?
It's an easy boat ride.
Oh, I've missed it.
It's an easy boat ride.
Someday, maybe. It's about half an hour maybe out there, or to the satellite images that I see, it's maybe 15. No, it's not even 15 kilometers out to sea, I don't think.
You can go from Western Turkey, from a port, let's say Kusadasi, in Western Turkey, and a boat leaves that port, it goes directly to Samos, and from Samos you can take a second boat, directly to the island of Patmos, the Greek island of Patmos.
Okay. What is it that we can learn about the message of the book of Revelation through studying the geography of the island?
Several things I think would be appropriate. One thing, it helps us to understand the whole process of communicating biblical truth in that first century world. How was mail delivered? How were letters delivered? In the case of the seven churches, if you just open up an atlas and you see the sequence of the seven churches, that sequence follows an established road. So of the seven churches, the church that is closest to Patmos is Ephesus. And from Ephesus, you simply go north on the road, a Roman road. These are all established Roman roads. And you end up about 50 miles north, you're at Smyrna, modern Izmir. You continue north on that same road until a place where you turn it off on another Roman road to the northeast, and you come to the major site of Pergamum. Continue on that road to the east and to the southeast, and you go by the sites in sequence of Sardis, Thyatira, Philadelphia, and you end up, and that same road ends up at Laodicea. And at Laodicea, there's a major road that runs east-west, and so you could get on that road at Laodicea and go right back to Ephesus. So if we're dealing with a courier who's communicating John's letters, is this one big letter to be read in 7 different churches? Is it 7 different letters, each to be read in one church? Is it 7 different letters, each to be read in all 7 churches? Similar to what Paul does, if you remember in Colossians, he talks about his letter to the Colossians that once it's read by the members of the church in Colossae, they're supposed to share it with the people in Laodicea. And then Paul adds something that we wouldn't otherwise know. He writes a letter to the church at Laodicea. We have no record of that. And he says, and make sure that you read that too. It's the same thing if you consider in Peter. Peter is writing, we assume that you have Petrine authorship there in 1 Peter. And the very first, I think it's the first two verses, verses 1 or maybe 1 and 2. From prison, Paul is telling us that he's writing to five contiguous, they're all contiguous, five contiguous Roman provinces. So it tells us the way in which mail was communicated. If you think about it for a second, all of the epistles that Paul addresses to a particular church, the church at Rome, the church at Corinth, the church at Ephesus, so forth and so on, is never written from that location. All of those epistles, without exception, are written by Paul at some other location. Sometimes there are debates about where those epistles were written, but I think everyone would agree that they're always written at another location and they had to be transported by courier to that location. Or in the case of Galatians, where he tells us explicitly in verse 2 that he writes to the churches of Galatia. So it's probably some of those churches that he established in his first and second missionary journeys in the Roman province of Galatia. But the idea is, once again, it's something that was delivered there. That's one thing that helps us to see. And then you start taking a look at the mileage that was involved in all of this. And it becomes staggering. If that courier who took Peter's letter from Rome went across to Istanbul, and at that point he started through those five Roman provinces, and you take the middle of each of those provinces. There were roads, but they didn't quite go like that. And that he did not return to Rome. That's over 1,500 miles just to have that letter read in five different provinces, probably in multiple churches in those provinces. Space is one indication of the difficulty of communicating in the biblical world. Today we have these, here you are in Germany and I am in the United States, or you've used WhatsApp or something like that, and you're talking. I'm leaving to go to Israel here in about 10 days, and I'm on my computer, or I'm on my phone, or having money transferred. I mean, we live in such an instant and global economy. We don't even work up a sweat in doing this, and yet that courier who left Patmos, or that courier who left Rome, or whoever the couriers were who took Romans to Rome and Corinthians and so forth and so on, you're dealing with an enormous outlay of mileage. And when you get on those roads, things ain't safe, not in a lot of Roman roads. So there's a whole dimension that addresses the courage and the core commitments that people had to the veracity of this gospel they were transferring from point A to point B.
Dr. Beitzel, I want to say thank you so much for a stream of absolutely fascinating observations. And that really is a beautiful sampler of what is in this resource and also what is in the other 5 volumes that are either published or soon to be published. So this is an extraordinary project that you put together, and thank you for sharing with us an hour and sharing with us a number of points. If I can ask a final question, and it's a question that we ask all the interviewees that we have on this show. We're privileged to speak to Christians of a broad spectrum of confessions, and one of the things that we're trying to do as we bring scholars from different Christian churches together is to help us envision, as a broader Christian body, what a reunited church could possibly look like. And so the question that I'd like to ask you, Dr. Beitzel, is what would it mean for the church to be united today? How would we recognize a reunited church, and what is it that we can do as individual Christians to pursue the unity for which Jesus prayed?
That is a very difficult question to try to address. It obviously has not been successful. Christianity in its various denominations and groups has, I guess you would say, has failed in that mission over the year. And there are these huge theological and denominational and doctrinal divides that are found in the church. And unfortunately, at least from my perspective, that trend seems to be going in the wrong direction. In the last 10 or 15 years because ideology and politics seems like it has entered that same realm, which is very sad and unfortunate. I will try to provide my answer for your question. And by that, I mean not my answer for others, but for myself. Barry, how can you live? How should you live in a way that could promote the unity of the church? I guess my first point would be to pray for that. And I confess, I do not pray for that with any degree of regularity. Perhaps that's a fault, but my prayer life does not regularly, daily, include a prayer that I might somehow be a light of unity. I do pray that occasionally, but I think prayer would be an obvious hopeful sign. Another is, I say to myself, I must be a beacon of truth, but I must couch truth in ways that do not divide. That is not to say that I'm not going to take a certain view. I've been discussing here certain opinions on this or that text and so forth. Or we could expand this into theological categories, this or that doctrine and so forth. It seems to me that much of the church has often been divisive in the way that it has set out its distinctives. Sometimes, maybe not maliciously so, but a lot of times at least deliberately. We do not believe this. And that's often true of Christians, and I mean by that even evangelicals or mainline denominations, in terms of the vis-a-vis versus the Catholic Church. And maybe it could be said of the Catholic Church, but we can hold to our individual views without having to be divisive. We don't have to give ground. By not being divisive, to me, does not mean we're giving ground. It doesn't mean that we're compromising. It doesn't mean that we're tolerating a lot, but it does mean that we're disagreeing more agreeably. I think that would be a place for me to start. That would be a place for individuals to start. And then, of course, you could also address your question pragmatically. Consider all of the financial resources that are used up in the world to promote individual churches and denominations and seminaries and the like. Imagine the resources from a purely pragmatic point of view. Imagine the resources that would be freed from such things and could be put more directly into the promotion of the Christian gospel. That's purely pragmatic, but I will tell you, I'm not free of pragmatic thinking either. So anyhow, I think we have the responsibility to try to divide the word of truth honestly and to seek to defend our views vigorously, but to confess to ourselves as well as others that none of us has a corner on truth. And we have to be willing to accept that as individual, responsible members of the Christian church.
It's been our huge privilege today to be speaking with Dr. Ryrie Beitzel. Dr. Ryrie Beitzel is Professor Emeritus of Old Testament and Semitic Languages at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in Deerfield, Illinois, north of Chicago, is editor of this text and its 5 companion volumes, Lexham Geographic Commentary on Acts through Revelation. 2 are out currently at the time of the recording of this interview. 4 are on the way. Check it out. It's truly an amazing resource. Dr. Beitzel, thank you so much for sharing some of your insights and perspectives. We're really grateful to have spoken with you today.
Thank you. I appreciate this invitation.